They called her the curse of the family and told her to leave on his father's recovery day. His mistress moved into her bedroom. His siblings cheered. Then the bank called. The company account was empty. 50 million withdrawn. She was already gone. That's when they understood what they'd lost. This is a story about a woman named Imani Bennett, and this is the story of how she saved an entire family in silence and left them in even deeper silence. The Bennett mansion sat on 5 acres of pristine land in the wealthy suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. It was the kind of house you see in magazines, the kind of house that whispers old money and generational wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they could make you feel small. Marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. And on this particular evening, every light in that massive house was burning bright because the Bennett family had something to celebrate. Raymond Bennett, the 68-year-old patriarch and founder of Bennett Realty Group, had recovered from a stroke that nearly killed him 6 months ago. The doctors called it a miracle. The family called it a blessing. And tonight they were throwing a party to thank God for bringing their father back from the edge of death. Champagne flowed like water. Laughter echoed through the grand foyer. Men in expensive suits and women dripping in diamonds filled every corner of the house. The celebration was loud, excessive, and full of the kind of joy that comes when people realize they almost lost everything but somehow held on. Raymond stood in the center of the living room, his arm around his wife Lorraine, a 65-year-old woman whose face had been surgically preserved in a state of permanent elegance. She smiled at the guests, her diamond necklace catching the light every time she moved. Their children stood nearby. Carlton, the 38-year-old eldest son and CFO of the company, tall and broad-shouldered with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and Simone, the 30-year-old youngest daughter, beautiful and sharp-tongued with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. And then there was Xavier, 35 years old, the middle child, the golden boy, the son Raymond had groomed to take over the family empire. Xavier stood near the fireplace, laughing at something one of the guests said, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked like success. Tailored navy suit, diamond cufflinks, a Rolex that cost more than most people's cars. But if you looked closely, if you really paid attention, you'd see something missing in his eyes, something hollow, something broken. Standing next to him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, was Gabrielle Monroe, 28 years old, stunning in a way that demanded attention. She wore a red dress that hugged every curve, her hair flowing in perfect waves down her back, her lips painted the color of wine. She laughed loud, spoke louder, and made sure everyone in the room knew she belonged there. She was a real estate agent at one of Bennett Realty Group's biggest competitors, but tonight she wasn't the enemy. Tonight she was family, or at least that's what Lorraine kept telling everyone. And sitting alone in the far corner of that grand living room, almost invisible in the shadow of a tall bookshelf, was Imani, 32 years old, quiet, plain in a way that made people's eyes slide right past her. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry except for a thin gold chain her grandmother gave her before she died. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands were folded in her lap, and in those hands she clutched a small leather journal, worn and soft from years of being held. She didn't drink champagne. She didn't laugh with the guests. She just sat there watching, her dark eyes taking in everything and saying nothing. Lorraine stood up suddenly, tapping her champagne glass with a fork until the room fell silent. She smiled, that practiced smile, the one she used at charity galas and board meetings. "I want to make a toast," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "to my husband's recovery, to the strength of this family, and to the blessing of having the right people in our lives." She paused, her eyes sliding briefly to Imani, before moving away just as quickly. Despite the bad luck some people brought into this family, God saw fit to protect us, and for that, I am grateful. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Glasses clinked, people drank, and Imani sat perfectly still, her fingers tightening around her grandmother's journal. Carlton muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for the people around him to hear. "The curse," he said, shaking his head. A few people laughed nervously. Simone giggled and whispered something to Gabrielle, who smirked and looked directly at Imani. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that second, Imani saw everything she needed to see: contempt, victory, ownership. Raymond cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice booming with the kind of authority that came from decades of building empires. "Come here, Imani," he said, gesturing for her to stand. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was heavy, uncomfortable. Imani stood slowly, smoothing down her dress, her journal still clutched in one hand. She walked to the center of the room, her footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floor. She stopped a few feet away from Raymond, her head slightly bowed, her eyes on the ground. Raymond looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he spoke. "You know, when my son married you 3 years ago, I had my doubts. You came from nothing, no family, no connections, no background that made sense for a Bennett." He paused, letting his words settle over the room like a heavy fog. "And I tried to give you a chance. I really did. But then I had my stroke. 1 month after you joined this family. 1 month, and while I was fighting for my life in that hospital bed, this company I built from the ground up nearly collapsed. Contracts fell through, investors pulled out. Everything I worked for almost disappeared." Lorraine stepped beside her husband, her voice cold and precise. "Everything was fine until you came," she said simply. "We were blessed, prosperous, successful. And then you walked through our door, and darkness followed." She looked at Imani with eyes that held no warmth, no compassion, nothing but cold calculation. "We want you to leave, tonight. This family doesn't need your bad energy anymore." The room was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. Imani didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, her fingers pressed against the leather journal, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "Dignity is the only wealth they can't take from you." She looked up slowly, her eyes moving from Raymond to Lorraine, then to Carlton, who stood with his arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on his face, then to Simone, who was barely containing her excitement, and finally to Xavier, her husband, the man she'd loved for 5 years, the man she'd married with hope and dreams of building something beautiful together. Xavier stood frozen, his bourbon glass halfway to his lips. His eyes met hers for just a second, and in that second, she saw everything: guilt, shame, and worst of all, relief. He looked away first, and Gabrielle, standing right beside him, slid her hand into his and squeezed. She didn't even try to hide it. She smiled at Imani, a smile that said, "I won." Imani nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Then she turned and walked toward the grand staircase that led to the second floor. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. No one stopped her. No one said a word. She climbed those stairs with her head high, her back straight, her dignity intact. And when she reached the master bedroom she'd shared with Xavier for 3 years, she found her suitcases already packed and sitting by the door. Someone had gone through her things. Someone had decided what she was allowed to take and what she had to leave behind. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just picked up the small leather journal, a framed photograph of her parents, and one suitcase. That's all she took. Then she walked back downstairs, past the living room where the party had resumed, past Carlton, who raised his champagne glass mockingly, past Simone, who actually applauded as she walked by, past Raymond and Lorraine, who stood like silent judges, and past Xavier, who still couldn't meet her eyes. She walked to the front door, stepped out into the cool Atlanta night, and didn't look back. The rain had started falling, light and gentle, soaking through her dress within seconds. She stood on the circular driveway, alone, with one suitcase and a grandmother's journal. And then she pulled out her phone and made one call. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "it's time. Withdraw everything." But to understand what happened next, you need to understand where Imani came from. You need to know the story behind the story. Because Imani Bennett wasn't who they thought she was, not even close. 23 years earlier, in a small rural town in South Carolina, there lived a little girl named Imani with her grandmother, Nana Ruth. Imani's parents had died in a car accident when she was 9 years old. A drunk driver ran a red light and took them both in an instant. After the funerals, after the tears, after the overwhelming silence of grief, Nana Ruth came and took Imani home. They lived in a modest house at the end of a dirt road surrounded by oak trees and wild flowers. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't big, but it was filled with love. Nana Ruth was 70 years old when she became Imani's guardian. She walked with a cane and wore the same 3 church dresses on rotation. She grew vegetables in her garden and canned preserves every summer. To anyone who saw them, they looked poor. Simple country folk barely getting by. But what no one knew, what Nana Ruth never told a soul, was that she was worth over $80 million. During the civil rights era, when most black folks were fighting just to survive, Nana Ruth had been quietly investing every penny she could save into black-owned businesses, real estate in neighborhoods white folks didn't want, and stocks in companies everyone thought would fail. She watched, she learned, she moved in absolute silence, and by the time she took in little Imani, she owned more wealth than most of the white families in 3 counties combined. But she never showed it, never flaunted it. She taught Imani to live simply, to appreciate what you have, and to never, ever announce your wealth. "Baby girl," she'd say, while they sat on the porch shelling peas. "People will love you for what you got, not who you are. And the moment you show them what you got, that's all they'll ever see." Imani grew up wearing hand-me-down clothes and eating meals cooked from the garden. She went to public school, rode the bus, had friends who never knew her grandmother slept on millions. And Imani was happy, genuinely, deeply happy. On Imani's 18th birthday, Nana Ruth gave her the leather journal. It was worn and soft, the kind of journal that had been held and read 1,000 times. On the first page, in Nana Ruth's careful handwriting, were 8 words. "Dignity is the only wealth they can't take from you." The rest of the journal contained everything: investment strategies, account numbers, stock portfolios, real estate deeds, instructions, and one final note on the last page: use this money to help others, but never let them use you. Nana Ruth passed away 2 years later, peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face, and Imani inherited everything, $80 million. She cried for a week straight, Not because of the money, because she'd lost the only person who ever truly loved her. She became a financial analyst, brilliant with numbers, living in a small apartment in Atlanta, driving a 10-year-old Honda, eating homemade lunches, and telling absolutely no one about the fortune sitting in offshore accounts under her name. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she had, just like Nana Ruth taught her. And then she met Xavier Bennett at a charity gala for homeless youth. He was charming, kind. He talked about his family's legacy, about building generational wealth for black families, about creating opportunities in communities that banks had abandoned. He had vision. He had passion. And when he looked at Imani, he didn't see her plain dress or her modest jewelry. He saw her, or at least she thought he did. They dated for 2 years. He never asked about her finances, never questioned why she lived so simply. He just seemed to accept her, love her. And when he proposed on a quiet beach in Savannah, she said yes with a heart full of hope. But the moment she married into the Bennett family, everything changed. Raymond looked at her like she was a stain on the family name. Lorraine made passive-aggressive comments about her lack of sophistication. Carlton called her the charity case behind her back. Simone treated her like hired help. And Xavier started working late, coming home at midnight, sleeping on the couch, forgetting anniversaries, skipping dinners. He became a stranger wearing her husband's face. 6 months into their marriage, Raymond had his stroke. Massive. Unexpected. He collapsed during a board meeting, his brain bleeding, his body failing. The doctors said it was a miracle he survived the first night. He spent 3 months in a coma, and during those 3 months, Bennett Realty Group fell apart. Carlton panicked and made bad deals. Investors smelled weakness and pulled out. Major clients terminated contracts. The banks called in loans. Within 90 days, the company was 30 days away from bankruptcy. The Bennett family, who'd spent decades building their empire, watched it crumble in real time. Lorraine blamed Imani, openly, loudly. She stood in the hospital chapel and told Imani to her face, "God is punishing us for letting you into this family." Carlton agreed. Simone cried and said Imani brought a curse, and Xavier said nothing. He just stared at his phone, paralyzed with fear, watching his inheritance disappear. Late one night, while the family slept in the hospital waiting room, Imani sat alone in the cafeteria with Mr. Leonard Hayes, the family's 70-year-old attorney. He'd been Raymond's lawyer for 40 years, a quiet man, honest, fair. He looked at Imani with kind eyes and said, "They're going to lose everything. The company will be bankrupt by next month. There's no way to save it." Imani was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and showed him her account balances. His eyes went wide. His mouth fell open. "Where did you—" he started, but she cut him off. "My grandmother," she said simply. "She taught me to save, to invest, to move in silence." She looked at him, her voice steady. "I want to transfer $50 million into the company's business account. Tonight. Save the company. But you cannot tell anyone where the money came from. Tell them it's an anonymous investor, someone who believes in the company's future. Can you do that?" Mr. Hayes stared at her. "Why would you do this? They treat you terribly. They blame you for everything. Why would you save them?" Imani looked down at her hands, at the simple wedding ring Xavier had given her. "Because I love him," she said quietly. "And I believe in what this family could be. Maybe if the company is saved, they'll see me differently. Maybe they'll finally let me in." Mr. Hayes shook his head slowly, but he did what she asked. By morning, $50 million appeared in Bennett Realty Group's account. The company was saved overnight. Debts were paid. Investors came back. Contracts were renewed. And when Raymond woke from his coma 2 weeks later, the doctors called it a miracle. The family called it a blessing. And Mr. Hayes told them exactly what Imani asked him to say. An anonymous investor believed in the company's future. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wondered. They just celebrated. And Imani sat in the corner of Raymond's hospital room, watching them rejoice, hoping this would be the moment everything changed. But it didn't. If anything, it got worse. Gabrielle Monroe walked back into Xavier's life like a hurricane. She was his college sweetheart, the woman he almost married before his father convinced him she wasn't serious enough for a Bennett. She'd spent the last 10 years building her career, becoming one of the top real estate agents in Atlanta, working for Bennett Realty Group's biggest competitor. She was loud where Imani was quiet, flashy where Imani was plain, connected where Imani was isolated, and she wanted Xavier back. It started innocently enough. Business lunches, client meetings, networking events. Xavier told Imani he was rebuilding relationships, securing contracts, doing what needed to be done to save the company. But the lunches turned into dinners. The dinners turned into late nights, and soon Xavier was coming home at 2 a.m, smelling like Gabrielle's perfume. Imani knew, of course she knew, but she didn't say anything. She just cooked his favorite meals and left them warming in the oven. She just folded his laundry and left it on his side of the bed. She just waited, hoping he'd come back to her. Lorraine started inviting Gabrielle to family dinners. "She's so vibrant," Lorraine would say, smiling at Gabrielle while completely ignoring Imani. "So full of life. So good for Xavier's career." Carlton would laugh and say, "Too bad Xavier married the wrong woman." Simone would giggle and call Gabrielle the daughter I always wanted. And Imani would sit there, eating in silence, clutching her grandmother's journal under the table like a lifeline. One night, 8 months after Raymond's recovery, Xavier came home and found Imani sitting on their bed. She'd been waiting for him. It was 3 a.m. He looked tired, guilty, empty. He sat down on the edge of the bed, not meeting her eyes. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was flat, defeated. Imani's heart started pounding, but she kept her face calm. "Okay," she said softly. Xavier took a deep breath. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air like smoke. Imani felt something crack inside her chest, but she didn't move, didn't cry. She just asked one question. "Do you love her?" Xavier looked down at his hands. "I need someone who fits into my life, someone my family accepts, someone who makes sense." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollow. "You're a good person, Imani, but you're not enough for this family. Gabrielle, she fits." Imani nodded slowly. She didn't beg, didn't plead, and didn't ask him to reconsider. She just whispered, "Okay." Xavier stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. He didn't come back that night, or the next, or the next. Imani lay in that big, empty bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of 3 years of invisibility crushing her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything except a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. 3 nights later, she opened her grandmother's journal and read the first page again. "Dignity is the only wealth they can't take from you." And something inside her shifted. Something hardened. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was just done. She pulled out her phone and texted Mr. Hayes. "Prepare the withdrawal documents. All of it, every penny." He responded within minutes. "Are you sure?" She typed one word. Yes. The party for Raymond's recovery was magnificent. The Bennett mansion had never looked more beautiful. Flowers everywhere, a live jazz band, catered food from the most expensive restaurant in Atlanta. Every important person in the city was there. Business moguls, politicians, society wives dripping in diamonds. And at the center of it all, Raymond stood tall and healthy, his arm around Lorraine, both of them glowing with the kind of joy that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. Imani wasn't invited to sit at the main table. She sat in the back, near the bookshelf, almost invisible. She wore her simple black dress, no makeup, no jewelry except for her grandmother's gold chain. She held the leather journal in her lap and watched as Gabrielle sat beside Xavier at the head table, her hand possessively on his arm. Gabrielle wore a massive diamond engagement ring. Xavier had proposed 3 days ago. The family was thrilled. Lorraine kept showing off Gabrielle to guests, saying, "Finally, a daughter-in-law who understands this family." Raymond stood to make a speech. The room fell silent. He smiled that patriarch smile, the one that commanded respect and attention. "I want to thank God," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I want to thank the doctors who saved my life. I want to thank my family for their strength. And I want to thank the mysterious investor who saved our company when we needed it most." He paused, and the room applauded. Then his expression changed. His smile faded. His eyes grew cold. "But I also want to address something that's been weighing on my heart," he continued. His gaze moved to Imani, and the entire room followed. 200 pairs of eyes turned to look at the quiet woman sitting alone in the corner. Some people bring blessings into your life, and some people bring curses. My stroke happened 1 month after this woman joined our family. 1 month. The company nearly collapsed. Everything I built almost disappeared. His voice grew harder. "I believe in signs. I believe God shows us who belongs and who doesn't. And I'm asking you, Imani, to leave this house tonight. My family deserves peace." The room went dead silent. You could hear the chandeliers tinkling in the breeze from the air conditioning. Imani stood slowly. She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, didn't cry. She just stood there, her journal clutched to her chest, her eyes clear and calm. She looked at Raymond, then at Lorraine, then at Carlton, who was smirking, then at Simone, who looked like she was about to burst with excitement, and finally at Xavier, her husband, the man she'd loved with everything she had. Xavier stared at his plate. Gabrielle squeezed his hand and smiled at Imani with pure triumph in her eyes. Imani nodded once. Then she walked upstairs to pack. The guests whispered. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked relieved. But nobody stood up for her. Nobody said a word. When Imani came back downstairs 15 minutes later, Gabrielle was already in the master bedroom measuring the windows for new curtains. Carlton and Simone stood in the foyer, champagne glasses raised, actually cheering as Imani walked past them with her single suitcase. Lorraine stood by the door, her arms crossed, her face cold. "You should have never come here," she said quietly. Imani stopped for just a second. She looked at Lorraine with eyes that held no anger, no pain, just a deep, infinite sadness. "You're right," she said softly. "I shouldn't have." She stepped out into the rain. The door closed behind her with a heavy, final sound. She stood on the circular driveway, soaking wet, utterly alone. She didn't call a cab. She just started walking. Down the long driveway, past the iron gates, into the dark Atlanta night. And as she walked, she pulled out her phone and made that call to Mr. Hayes. "It's time," she said. "Withdraw everything. Inside the mansion, the party continued. Champagne flowed. Music played. Gabrielle showed off her engagement ring to anyone who would look. Raymond gave another toast about family and loyalty and the importance of removing toxic people from your life. Xavier drank bourbon and tried to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. And then, exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes, after Imani walked out that door, Raymond's phone rang. He frowned at the unknown number, but answered anyway. "This is Raymond Bennett." The voice on the other end was panicked, desperate. "Mr. Bennett, this is Michael Chen from First National Bank. We have an emergency. The company account, sir, it's been completely drained. $50 million was withdrawn an hour ago. The account is empty." Raymond's face went white. His champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The music stopped. Guests turned to stare. "That's impossible," Raymond said, his voice shaking. "Who authorized that withdrawal?" The banker's voice trembled. "According to our records, sir, the account authorization belongs to Mrs. Imani Bennett. She was listed as the primary investor and account holder." The phone slipped from Raymond's hand. Lorraine rushed over. "What's wrong? Raymond, what happened?" He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Carlton grabbed the phone from the floor. "Hello, this is Carlton Bennett. What the hell is going on?" The banker explained again. Carlton's face went from confusion to shock to pure horror. "She doesn't have that kind of money," he said. "She's nobody. She came from nothing." The banker's voice was quiet now, almost sympathetic. "Actually, Mr. Bennett, according to our records, Mrs. Imani Bennett was the anonymous investor who saved your company 6 months ago during your father's illness. She deposited $50 million of her own money, and tonight she withdrew every penny." The line went dead. Carlton dropped the phone. He looked at his father, at his mother, at Simone, whose mouth was hanging open, at Xavier, who had stood up so fast his chair fell over. "She saved us," Carlton whispered. "The whole time. It was her. She saved the company. She saved all of us." Simone's champagne glass fell from her hand. Lorraine stumbled backward. Raymond clutched his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow. Xavier ran. He didn't think. He just ran. Out of the living room, out the front door, into the rain. He ran down the driveway, screaming Imani's name. But she was gone. He pulled out his phone and called her. The number was disconnected. He called again. Disconnected. He ran back inside, up the stairs to their bedroom. Every piece of clothing she owned was gone. Every photo, every book, every trace of her had been erased. Only Gabrielle's things remained, spread across the bed, claiming territory. Xavier collapsed on the floor, his expensive suit soaking wet, his whole body shaking. Downstairs, Raymond sat in his office with his head in his hands, while Mr. Hayes stood in the doorway. "You knew," Raymond said, his voice broken. "You knew it was her money the whole time." Mr. Hayes nodded slowly. "She made me promise not to tell. She wanted to help. She loved your son. She loved this family, and you treated her like garbage." Lorraine appeared in the doorway, mascara running down her face. "Can we get the money back? Can we sue her? There has to be something." Mr. Hayes cut her off. "The money was legally hers. She can do whatever she wants with it. And what she wants is to never see any of you again." Within 1 week, without that $50 million, Bennett Realty Group couldn't cover its debts. Banks called in loans. Investors pulled out again, this time permanently. Major clients terminated contracts. The company that Raymond had spent 40 years building collapsed in less than 10 days. They filed for bankruptcy. The mansion went into foreclosure. The cars were repossessed. The family's entire world fell apart. Carlton tried to negotiate with creditors, but nobody wanted to work with a family that had lost everything twice. Simone had to sell her designer wardrobe just to pay rent on a tiny apartment. Raymond had another stroke from the stress, smaller this time, but devastating nonetheless. Lorraine stopped speaking to him, blaming him for driving away the only person who could have saved them. And Gabrielle? The moment she realized Xavier had nothing left, she broke off the engagement over text. "I thought you were building an empire, not living in your parents' basement. Good luck, baby." She didn't even ask for the ring back. She just disappeared. Moved to Los Angeles. Started dating a tech billionaire. Xavier sat in his empty apartment surrounded by boxes of things from his old life, staring at that text message for hours. He hired private investigators to find Imani. They found nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. One night, going through old photos, he found their wedding picture. Imani was smiling softly, looking at him like he was her whole world. And he was looking at his phone, barely paying attention. He stared at that photo until his vision blurred. He finally understood what he'd lost. Not just money, not just security, but a woman who had loved him so completely, so selflessly, that she'd given everything to save him and his family, and he'd thrown her away like she was nothing. Raymond died 6 months later. The stress, the shame, the weight of knowing he'd destroyed an angel, it was too much for his heart to carry. On his deathbed, with Lorraine holding his hand, he whispered, "We killed the only blessing God ever sent us." Lorraine nodded, tears streaming down her face. But it was too late. Far too late. 6 months after she left the Bennett mansion, Imani sat on the front porch of her grandmother's house in South Carolina. She'd bought it back, restored it, made it beautiful again. The oak trees swayed in the breeze. Wildflowers bloomed in the garden. And inside, the house had been transformed into a non-profit organization for Black women escaping toxic marriages. Women came from all over the South, broken and afraid, and Imani gave them a safe place to heal. She gave them financial counseling, legal support, therapy, hope. She sat in her grandmother's old rocking chair, the leather journal in her lap, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. A car pulled up the driveway. A young woman stepped out, her face bruised, her eyes hollow, carrying a crying baby on her hip. Imani stood and walked down the porch steps. She didn't say anything. She just opened her arms. The young woman collapsed into them, sobbing. "I had nowhere else to go," she whispered. Imani held her tight. "You're safe now," she said softly. "You're home." Letters came sometimes, from Xavier, from Lorraine, even from Carlton, long letters full of apologies and regrets and desperate pleas for forgiveness. Imani never opened them. She kept them in a drawer in her bedroom, dozens of unopened envelopes gathering dust. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She just didn't care anymore. They were ghosts from a life she'd left behind. And ghosts can't hurt you if you don't let them in. One Sunday morning, Imani drove to the cemetery where her grandmother was buried. She brought fresh flowers, white roses, Nana Ruth's favorite. She knelt beside the simple headstone and placed the roses gently on the grass. "You were right, Nana," she whispered. "Dignity is the only wealth they can't take." She smiled, tears running down her face. But they weren't sad tears. They were healing tears, free tears. "Thank you for teaching me that." She stood, brushed the dirt off her knees, and walked back to her car. She drove home slowly, windows down, gospel music playing softly on the radio. When she got home, 3 more women were waiting on her porch, bags in hand, hope in their eyes. Imani greeted each one by name, led them inside, and started the kettle for tea. This was her life now. This was her purpose, and she'd never felt more at peace. Imani didn't need revenge. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need them to understand what they'd lost. She needed freedom. And sometimes the greatest power you have is the ability to walk away from people who never deserved you in the first place. She saved them in silence. And she left them in silence because real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply moves, quietly, powerfully, with dignity that can never be taken away. Have you ever sacrificed everything for someone who didn't appreciate you? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your story below. And remember, your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it. I'll see you in the next story. Stay strong.